Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we're doing an exclusive interview with Earl Rynerson, who's the author of a new book on one of my favorite subjects, capitalism. It's called Unchecked Capitalism, and we're going to talk all about his unique perspective on how capitalism is killing us all. It's going to be a fun episode where we lampoon defense contractors, go after the food industry, talk about healthcare, and all the other ways in which our unchecked capitalist system is collectively screwing us over. This is the Cameron Journal podcast. This is the Cameron Journal podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. It's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal podcast. Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, I am really excited to be speaking with Earl Rynerson, who's published a new book on one of our favorite topics around here, on capitalism. And we're going to talk to him today about his background, why he decided to write a book about how capitalism is killing us, and obviously provide links because this is a absolute must-read. Welcome to the podcast, Earl. How are you?
Thank you. I'm doing well today.
Excellent, thank you. So, why don't you start from the beginning and give us a little bit of background on yourself, what you've done, and why you decided to write this book on capitalism?
Okay, well, a little bit about my background. I spent 20 years in the military, am a retired lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. I have also been in high tech. I was in computer hardware and software sales for about 20 years in San Francisco. And for the last 20 or so years, I've been a small business owner here in Fort Lauderdale. One of the things that I have always enjoyed doing is writing about problems that I think affect the population that I am involved in. In San Francisco, I wrote about how San Francisco's handing out cash to homeless folks was worsening their addiction because they would take the cash and spend it on drugs and alcohol and overflow the local hospital. So I wrote about that. And then in Fort Lauderdale, I wrote about the wasteful spending in state government and how the infrastructure was going to hell and was not being maintained properly. And now we are having to pay more money to repair sewer lines and water lines that are breaking the city. So I've written a fair amount in the past on problems that I see, and this book I started about a year and a half ago, and I started getting incensed when I saw how large corporations were taking advantage of small people, regular customers, regular Americans. And Wells Fargo Bank, I started doing research on that bank and how they were scamming customers, instituting new accounts that the customers didn't want and charging them fees for those accounts, and how they were doing that with millions and millions of accounts just to get a stronger profit margin, stronger bottom line. So they were taking advantage of people, and I didn't like that. So I started researching that, discovered other banks were doing largely the same thing, and then it branched from banking to oil and gas, defense, processed foods, a number of other industries, and I discovered to my horror that capitalism has gotten out of control in our country and has been that way for the last 40 years, and corporations are now the ones that are running our government, not our elected officials. And so that's what, when I discovered this, that's what forced me to write this book.
Right, so particularly in one part of your book, you write about the military-industrial complex, and I'm very interested to find out what your perspective is on military defense contracting as someone who is in the military and has been and used the products and services that these companies like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon offer to the military, and what your perspective on that is. Because in the book, you rather take them to task.
Well, somebody needs to take them to task. You know, having spent 20 years in the military, I did not have direct access to any of the military contracts or spending or how much in the way of profits these corporations were getting from the government. I never saw the $20,000 toilet seat that people have spoken about in the past in certain situations. But I was a navigator on a KC-135. I was in Desert Storm and Desert Shield. And when I was in the military, I basically focused on doing my job and doing it well. I didn't really have an opinion one way or the other about excessive military spending, but that opinion that I have now has been derived from the last year and a half, 2 years of studies on how these defense industry corporations have basically bribed and blackmailed their way into Washington and are ready and able to paint any politician a traitor who does not want to continue to spend exorbitant amounts of money toward those industries. And one can take a look at World War II. Our government back then dictated to businesses as to what they were going to build, when they were going to build it, how much they were going to build, what the price was of the item they were going to build, whether it was a battleship or a pair of combat boots. And we ended up winning a two-front war during World War II in 4.5 years. And that was because government was in control of these corporations and telling them what to do, and these corporations basically saluted and did what they were told. It's the other way around now, I've learned, and that is that corporations are dictating to government elected officials what they should vote for and what they shouldn't vote for. And what's resulted now is never-ending wars in the Middle East, and the only beneficiary of those Middle Eastern conflicts, the only beneficiary are these large defense contractors who get paid billions and billions of dollars to stay over there to provide, quote, products or services that our troops over there supposedly need. So here we are now. I think it's close to 20 years. We have had a presence in a third world country, and we still are no closer to resolving that conflict now than we were when we got involved in it 20 years ago. And we don't have a clear objective on what we are supposed to be doing when we're over there. And it's only because the defense industry has their lockdown in Washington, ensuring that legislators continue to fund their presence over there. And I think that's wrong.
Well, yes, I think that is definitely an issue, but I also want to kind of get your opinion on this, because capitalism is sold as one of the most efficient, economic systems on the planet. If you make it, yay. If not, oh well. And the best way to make it is to be incredibly efficient and low cost and all this type of thing. But somehow when we get to military defense contracting, the rules of capitalism quit seeming to apply somehow, in terms of waste and inefficiency seem to be the order of the day. Yeah. And so I wanted your perspective of, is that just because these companies are really bad at their jobs, or is it that they're really just bilking the American taxpayer for their own personal profits?
They're bilking the taxpayer for their own personal profits. There might be some ineptitude in there as well. But in my book, I write about how a study was done. I think it was the last couple of years of the Obama administration, that they looked at the military budget and discovered that they could more than likely shave about 30% of the budget down without having any impact on military readiness or on troop levels. And when the department heads saw the amount of reduction that this independent study group was coming up with, they got nervous that their funds were going to be cut back in their particular departments, so they stopped participating in the study. Legislators who have military bases in their locations stopped participating because nobody wanted to have their funds cut. So the amount of energy and effort that went into doing this study on efficiency in the Defense Department fell apart because nobody wanted to be the sacred goat to be slaughtered, if you will, by having their budget cut back.
Yes, that makes sense, and it's important to note that we have almost still as many military bases as we had during the Cold War. There's only one problem: the Cold War ended when I was 2, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Because every time someone mentions, "Oh, we should close military bases," I think Congress has a collective heart attack.
Yeah, no, we closed a number. I remember we closed a number of air bases back in the early '80s, or maybe the early '90s, and it didn't have any big negative impact on anyone other than the locally elected representatives where those bases were. But after a year or two, the constituents didn't care because the economy always rebounds when a military establishment closes. But when you look at globally, the amount of money that we pump into the U.S. defense budget, the monies that we pay every year equal the budgets of the next 7 largest defense budgets of the 7 countries that have those defense budgets. I'm not saying it quite well, but we spend more per year on our defense budget than the next 7 countries combined. So that includes China, Russia, England, France, Italy, Germany. All these countries together, if you added up their military budgets, I think it's seven countries, the next 7 largest defense budgets, we still spend more than those next 7 countries combined. And that there's something wrong with that. And then the other problem that we have is a lot of this money that we spend does not go toward quality product or service. In my studies, I discovered that there are dozens and dozens of cases in my chapter on defense where corporations, to try to make more money on their side, would provide faulty equipment or failed equipment, or say that a service was performed when it wasn't, just to scam the government and to make more money and not provide the services that they're supposed to provide. So in addition to spending too much money, we also are getting defective equipment in many cases.
Yes, when you were talking about that, I was thinking of the many problems with the F-35 program, which have been legendarily covered because the planes are very expensive, and in many cases they don't work, and at one time they shouldn't fly in the rain.
Yes.
It seems to be a problem.
Another example, if I might butt in here, is
yes.
I was a navigator on a KC-135, which is an air refueling tanker for the Air Force. The government now has contracted with Boeing to come up with a new air refueling tanker. I believe it's called the KC-46, if I'm not mistaken. And that contract has had nothing but problems, where the Boeing workers leave tools and shavings and garbage in the planes as they're building them. A number of technological features of the airplane don't work as they're supposed to. The boom operator who sits in the airplane to refuel the other aircraft coming in don't have a good visual view of the aircraft that are coming in. There are all sorts of problems with the KC-146 aircraft, and it's just simply because Boeing is trying to do stuff on the cheap, and they end up delivering a product to the government that is reflective of a cheap product. And so we're spending more money and we're getting less in terms of the quality of what we're supposed to be getting.
Yes, it's funny you should mention that, because that was going to be the next airplane I was going to mention. Living in Seattle, obviously anything to do with Boeing is major news in this town. And the issues with the KC-146 have been covered in the Seattle Times over and over and over again. And the amount of money that Boeing charged the government to fix the problems they created is rather legendary. So they've delivered all these planes, and now we, the taxpayer, are going to pay $10 billion to fix the problems that they started.
Yeah, I think Boeing is also having to pay billions of dollars out of their own pocket for the mistakes that they've made, because the contract with the government stipulates that certain deliverables had to be accomplished within a certain time frame, and if those planes were not delivered by a certain time frame, Boeing would have to incur the costs associated with that. At least that's my recollection. But Boeing, we could talk all day about how screwed up Boeing is as a company. They used to be, the pride of America, the greatest airplane manufacturer in the world in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. But in 1997, they merged with McDonnell Douglas, another a failed aircraft manufacturer who was only interested in the bottom line. They were less interested in delivering quality aircraft than they were. They were less interested in delivering quality aircraft. They were more interested in making sure they were profitable. And so they took their eye off the ball, and every airplane that McDonnell Douglas built had problems. And when McDonnell Douglas and Boeing merged in 1997, the Boeing went from being a stellar company that everybody could be proud of to a failed institution that kept manufacturing airplanes based on a 50-year-old airplane design. And now we've seen the MAX 8 plane, which is an example of their penny-wise, pound-foolish approach to aircraft design, caused 2 crashes that killed, I think it was 346 people. And it was just simply because Boeing did not want to make a new aircraft. Boeing wanted to use the same 50-year-old airframe, stick an even bigger engine on the plane that was so large they had to build the engine up in front of the wing as opposed to hanging underneath the wing, which made it unstable. And here are the executives of Boeing being paid tens of millions of dollars a year to run that company, and they did nothing but run the company into the ground by trying to be cheap.
Yes, and that, I think, is going to be even more emblematic when we move on to the next fun industry that a lot of people have a lot of experience with, and that is the banking industry. This is an area where I believe capitalism has basically run amok in the most worst way, and it affects people's everyday lives and their economic futures, as we saw in 2008. So why don't you walk us through the Wells Fargo account scandal and how the banks are bilking us this time?
Well, I mean, again, this is a topic that would take hours and hours, but that was the thing that got me started in writing my book, is when I discovered all of the illegal activities that Wells Fargo Bank was doing to try to get more money out of their customer base. And it started by the discovery that they were adding accounts to their customers without telling their customers that they were adding new accounts, and then charging them fees for managing those accounts. So customers, I forget how many millions of customers they had that were suddenly seeing bills of $5, $10, $20, $30 for accounts that they did not sign up for. And it was just simply a way for them to scam the public and make more money. And other banks have done that as well. I've learned that many banks have been involved in money laundering with illegal drug cartels with countries like Russia, Afghanistan, Mexico. They will do banks. The largest banks in our country that have the most power are basically free to do what they want to do if it helps them make more money. And it doesn't matter whether it's legal or illegal, they will do it. And in 2008, they discovered that they could take all of these bad mortgages that had been foisted on people during the run-up in the housing market with adjustable loans that were coming due, and they knew that those loans were going to fail, and they started packaging them with good loans and called the collection of mortgages A or double A mortgages, when in fact they were garbage mortgages, and sold those mortgage packages on the open market. Insurance companies got involved, bought these large pension firms bought these packages of failed mortgages, and the banks knew they were rotten, and they still peddled them as quality product. and then the whole house of cards collapsed, and people lost their homes, pension firms lost their money, large insurance companies that were there to provide home insurance lost a lot of money, and then we ended up, I think this was when Obama got involved, became president, we had to bail out these banks to keep them from going under, which from my perspective is the worst thing that we could have done. We should have let them all fail, frankly. But we give them money, and after it was all said and done, we look back and most of these large banks, a portion of what they received, which was supposed to go to help out people who lost their homes, instead was spent on bonuses to their executives. And it's insane to me that we have a country that we allow these types of crooks to get away with this. These banks, I list the 5 worst banks in my book. These banks should be broken up. The Dodd-Frank laws that were put in place after the 2008 Great Recession have been watered down thanks to constant lobbying from the banking industry. We should break up these banks, make these banks regional in nature, not national, and the banks should either be a bank or an investment house. They can't be both, and that's one of the problems that we've had. We've allowed banks to become investment houses as well as banks, and so now they get involved in a lot of questionable activities in money laundering to boost their profits so that they can look bigger and more powerful next year than this year, and that's wrong. We need to take a stronger stand against these financial institutions.
Yes, and I think the regional banking idea is something that I think a lot of people are not necessarily aware of. And I think most people don't understand that, national banks going coast to coast is a fairly regional phenomena in terms of it's something that after the Great Depression, when banks collapsed and all this type of thing, the federal government discouraged heavily. The state where I grew up, Colorado, did not allow branch banking. So all banks had to be local. Mm-hmm. National banks, they changed that law when I was in high school, so 2005, 2006. And that was the first time you actually saw branches from the big national banks pop up. Because every bank had to be local. You went to your local bank. And that was it. That was all the options that you had, but that also meant you had a better relationship with your bank. Banks were more solvent. They were easier to regulate because they were smaller. Exactly. I think these big banks are too big for the government to regulate. They're just too complex.
Yes.
And that is kind of, caused all these problems. So I think that regional idea is better just because a smaller bank over a couple states is a lot easier to regulate than a big national bank with incredibly complex financial relationships all over the world.
Keep in mind that these, people when they start seeing the scope of the problems that we're dealing with right now, 2 things keep coming up. One is, how in the world did we get to this point in our country? And most people don't realize that it's been going on ever since the 1980s, very gradually. Every year something else happens that makes large corporations a little bit stronger, a little bit more profitable, a little bit more involved in bribing and lobbying elected officials in Washington. And I just suddenly forgot what the other issue was. But the amount of time that we've had since the 1980s, it's been going on so gradually and so slowly that we really don't realize the extent of the problem until we can look at it on a much larger level. And the second point is that it's not just the banks. Every large corporation, and that's why I write about it based on industry by industry. Every large multinational corporation here in the country that spends millions or billions of dollars on lobbyists to get Washington's elected officials to do what they want them to do, is the other part of this problem. It's been going on a long time. It's been gradually getting worse. And these major industries, each one is involved in Washington to such a degree that our voices don't get heard, and our health and welfare are negatively impacted because the legislation helps corporations. It does not help us.
Yes, I mean that is, and that's a rule of capitalism across all industries. The other issue with banking I have that deeply affects people, and what really kind of made the financial collapse so bad, was financialization. And I wonder what you think about this, because in my essay, How We the People Became We the Corporation, in my book, What the Hell is Going On, I posited, my thesis was, the reason capitalism works the way it does now is because capitalism seeks out a frictionless return, in terms of the most money back for the least money out. And the ideal capitalism is when you can make money without having to really do anything to make money. And that is expressed best in the financialization of markets, because in the housing crisis, you had people who made millions, billions really, of dollars selling those mortgages around, creating insurance products on those mortgages, selling those insurance products, taking those in, and then packaging those insurance policies together and selling those, and doing all of these things, which created lots and lots of money without really adding any value.
Exactly.
Essentially, they weren't making anything. They weren't selling a product or service. They were just basically shuffling paper around and charging people fees for the privilege of doing so, which is, kind of, I think, capitalism taken to its logical, most horrific end.
I make a comment sort of like that, but not as eloquently as you. But I discuss, and I think it's in chapter 2, about the Bain Corporation, Mitt Romney's corporation, as a organization that buys out companies and restructures them, sells off the parts. Basically, he calls it venture capital, but a lot of people call his firm and other firms like this vulture capital firms. And about how his organization doesn't make anything. And I compare his role in a venture capital / vulture capital firm to the role of his father, who was the governor of Michigan, who was also the head of, prior to being governor of Michigan, he was the president of American Motors, and he had thousands of employees. He made a product, an automobile or automobiles that people wanted, that people used. He paid the workers at that time what I believe was a fair. So he made something that our country could use, as opposed to his son, who's the head of a vulture capital firm, who basically makes money by going out, buying companies, destroying employees' lives by firing people, ending their pension benefits for the sake of being able to sell off parts of a company at a profit from what they paid originally.
Yes, to kind of give a grounded example, that's what happened with Toys R Us. Toys R Us actually wasn't going under. It actually was doing quite fine. The problem is that the hedge fund that owned it had burdened it down with so much debt, it became unprofitable from the debt. Not that it wasn't making money and revenue and people weren't shopping at its stores and all this type of thing. And regrettably, thousands of workers were fired because a hedge fund decided it was more expedient to put it into bankruptcy and close it than to just run a decent toy business.
Yes.
And I think that's emblematic of how capitalism works now with financialization, is that you have all these people going around doing all of these things and making decisions that affect people's lives and our economy and all this type of thing, rather than just simply running a business that sells products and services.
Yes, we've allowed this to just run amok in our nation, and it has to be curtailed. My only suggestion is that any organization that calls themselves a venture capital firm or is making money by buying and selling companies or investing in stocks, they need to be heavily regulated, and they need to be heavily taxed. That is the only way to limit from my perspective, their activities, and hopefully slow the a number of people who are being let go from these companies that they end up buying.
Yes, and so to that, what would you say to free market Republicans who come along and say, "Oh yeah, Earl and Cameron, this all sounds really bad," and blah 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 blah. But hey, that's why our markets are so good. That's why our economy is so dynamic. That's why we're on top, is because we pretty much let you do what you want to in this country without a whole lot of, European style regulations or even Asian style regulations. What would you say to those Republicans who are kind of like, I guess, yeah, there's some knock-on effects, but is it so bad? Your TV is cheaper, your cars are cheaper, we have a higher standard of living, median household income is up. What are you two complaining about? What would you say to them?
Well, I think, and I've had people comment about my book on different websites and Facebook groups, and I'm starting to get, I'm starting to see what a lot of the comments are from these folks. Somebody said, "Well, you're just a Marxist. Go back to a communist country," and what does lobbyists have to do with capitalism and all this kind of nonsense? And I'm trying. What I'm trying to do is to inform people by saying, look, there is socialism on one end, which is where governments dictate to businesses. There is capitalism, what I call in the middle of a bell curve, which is where businesses and government kind of maintain a hands-off approach, and government allows businesses to succeed or fail on their own, which, by the way, means no bailouts from the government when companies screw up. And then on the other extreme, and again, if you can imagine a bell curve, so on the far left side you have socialism, in the middle of the bell curve you have capitalism, and on the far right side of the bell curve you have unchecked capitalism. And unchecked capitalism is where we are today, and that is where corporations dictate to government. Socialism is where government dictates to business. Unchecked capitalism is where business dictates to the government. And that's what we've been having gradually go on in our country since the 80s under Ronald Reagan, when they brought in business industry executives to help advise on how to run the government. And as a result of that, we had corporate taxes go way down. We had debt in our nation start to go up. And now today, we've got a close to, if not over, a $30 trillion deficit, thanks to corporations constantly pushing on our government to lower taxes for corporations. They don't care about individual taxes, they care about their taxes. So, when I try to explain socialism versus capitalism versus unchecked capitalism, I try to inform people that, it's not capitalism versus socialism. Capitalism is fine, but in order for capitalism to be successful and to benefit the population, to benefit our country, you have to have controls, you have to have regulations, you have to have corporate taxes. That has to be in place. When you remove that, then you have corporations becoming so powerful that they can dictate to government. And that is what has happened over the last 20 to 30 years, most notably with the pharmaceutical Medicare Modernization Act, I believe it was called, in 2002, where the pharmaceutical company wrote government legislation and told our legislators to pass it. And that basically gave them unlimited ability to raise drug prices, which is why our prices on our medicines are so high today.
Yes, and for the listener who doesn't remember that act, that I believe started Medicare Part D, which was the prescription benefit program that at the time people said was basically unfunded. Congress did not allocate enough money for it. And those chickens are coming home to roost because prescription drug costs in Medicare now occupy a quarter of the federal budget. Right. Is how bad it has gotten.
People want to defend the status quo, but they don't recognize that the status quo now has gotten gradually worse for so many people for so long that you can't go you can't go to a hospital without bankrupting yourself when you're sick. That's one of the problems we have right now with the coronavirus. People don't want to go to get treated or to get tested at a hospital because the prices are so high. Many people still don't have insurance, and they don't know what they're going to do when they start getting the sniffle. And the biggest reason to have a standard healthcare program across the United States is for this very reason that we find ourselves in today, the pandemic. When we have basic health care for everybody, when you have a problem where you think you might have this coronavirus or symptoms of the coronavirus, you should be able to easily go get tested and get treated. But because we don't have health care for everybody, people are afraid to go, and that's what's making the spread of this problem, this virus, so much worse.
Yes, and yes, that is when it comes to healthcare. That's, I think, another industry where capitalism has definitely gone off the rails.
Unchecked.
Yes, and I think, and it was also a good transition because I know in the book you talked a lot about the food industry and processed foods and what they've been up to. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what the food industry has done and how unchecked capitalism has also ruined things that we eat?
Well, if you go into a grocery store today, the center part of the grocery store is really packed full of processed foods. If you stay around the perimeters of a grocery store, that's where you'll find fresh produce, fresh dairy, the healthy products. People don't seem to understand that since the 1960s, there has been a concerted effort by the sugar industry and the processed food industry to label fat in a person's diet as a problem. That it was you needed to lower the amount of fat that you were taking, which was causing you health problems. But it really wasn't the amount of fat that the average consumer was taking in back in the 60s and 70s and 80s that was causing a problem. It was the fact that processed foods started replacing fat with sugar in their products to make them taste good. Sugar is not a nutrient. Sugar is an addictive product. And the more sugar you take in, the more you want. And so the processed food and sugar industries knew that, and they knew that if they could get people addicted to the amounts of sugar that they were hoping they would take on a daily basis, that they would become addicted to the amount of sugar they would want to eat more and more of the product that they were selling, and it would help those companies make more money and sell more products because they were adding more sugar into those products. The same thing as a drug dealer selling cocaine on the street corner. If you can get somebody hooked on your product, you'll make more money. And the sugar industry and the processed food industries realized that they could make a lot more money and get more people hooked on their product by adding sugar to everything that they sold. So you have pasta sauce, cereals, milk, packaged foods, anything that comes in a can will oftentimes have sugar added to the product to make it taste better. The amount of sugar that we are supposed to be taking in on a daily basis is somewhere between 25 and 30 grams of sugar a day. And you can take more, you can ingest more grams of sugar in a light breakfast meal than you should be taking for the whole day. If you have a glass of milk, that's 12 grams of sugar. If you have a bowl of cereal, that can be anywhere from 15 to 30 grams of sugar. So right then, you've already exceeded your maximum allowance of sugar. But then as you go through the day, you have a donut, you have a salad with dressing, you have your regular meal. And at dinner time, it's often not unusual to be able to take in up to 300 grams of sugar a day. And you're ingesting that much sugar because of the over-reliance on processed food. That's why we have such an obesity problem in our country today. That is why, myself included, we have people who are diabetic, we have people who have cancer, we have people who have many other diseases and health-related problems because we have not controlled or regulated processed food and the sugar industry, and we have not done a good enough job of educating the public that sugar, not fat, but sugar is our big dietary enemy.
Yeah, and I think the good thing about that is that now it's finally coming out. I mean, everyone I think figured out that fat-free stuff was no good. You can't, very rarely will you find anything marked fat-free on the shelf anymore. That whole fad is long gone. And I think people are finally figuring out that there's just way too much sugar and way too many things. And I think a lot of people are getting smarter on that. But we have a long way to go. I mean, it's something where we just have so long to go on that.
And it's not we're not gonna find a solution without our government getting involved and educating people, number one, and number two, regulating processed foods to make sure that they're not putting in so much sugar and not allowing the processed food lobbyists to go into Washington to dictate to our government what we should or should not do relative to sugar intake. For example, I think something happened about 10 years ago where, no, it was during the Obama administration, they wanted to put a label on all products that showed how much sugar was being added to that particular product. Yeah. Camp Soup and the cranberry industry fought tooth and nail, and they were able to get the legislation changed. Campbell's Soup didn't want people to know how much sugar was in their products, and the cranberry juice industry didn't want people to know that, you know, if they didn't add sugar, nobody would be drinking cranberry juice because it was so unappetizing. The only way you can drink cranberry juice is to have, 20, 30, 40, 50 grams of sugar per serving to make it edible. So they fought our government, and they were able to get legislation relaxed so that it did not, it was not that we were not able to educate the consumer on the dangers of sugar because of that.
Yes, and that is why the savvy shopper, including myself, shops the edge of the grocery store and not the middle of the grocery store.
Everybody, yes, very good, very good.
Yes, that's what the savvy consumer does nowadays. So, between all the industries that you cover, which do you think is the worst offender for really using the principles of capitalism against everyone else? Who's the biggest offender?
Well, I don't know if I can say who the biggest offender is. And remember, I'm not anti-capitalism. I do not like the fact that we allowed capitalism to take over our government. We need to regulate capitalism. We can't throw out capitalism because it's what has made our country successful. And I keep looking back to the time when I was a kid in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I remember how proud we as a nation were on how much we were able to accomplish in our country compared to other countries. So, I'm somebody that comes from the idea that capitalism is a good thing, but it has to be regulated. And when we allow corporations to become so large they dictate to our government, that's wrong. And that is why I wrote this book. But as far as industries go, probably the worst ones are the banking industry, because they destroyed our economy in 2008, and they're on track to do it again. Pharmaceutical industry, because of their ability to write legislation that allowed them to raise prices without any government restrictions. Also, corporations like Purdue Pharma that pumped out opioids because they and other drug companies discovered the benefits of selling addictive drugs like opioids. They should be, frankly, I think the executives of many of those larger corporations should be jailed because they have caused tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of deaths in our country because they were promoting these drugs as being safe when they weren't. So they're one of the worst. Hospitals, the healthcare industry is also one of the worst. There are no such things. There's no such thing as a nonprofit hospital anymore. When the CEOs of hospitals are making 10, 15, $20 million a year running a large multi-location hospital chain, you know good and well that the hospitals are not for profit. They are all profit driven, and so that means that they don't do anything to help patients. They're only there for their profits. So they're a bad one. Oil and gas, defense industry. They're all of the industries that I talk about. Even the media industry has gotten to the point where the profits are what they focus on, and so their behavior is adjusted to maximize their profits, and their behavior causes us direct harm.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I highly encourage people to pick up this book. Why don't you let us know, where can we find your book?
If you can go to Amazon, to the book section, and just type in 2 words, Unchecked Capitalism, and you will find the book. It's a bright red book with bombs raining down on people on the front page. It says, "Wake up, unchecked capitalism is killing us." The wake up part is just part of the picture on the front cover. It's not part of the title. But it's available in ebook, paperback, and hard copy books on Amazon.
Excellent, excellent. We'll definitely post links in the description for people. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Earl. I really appreciate you coming on the Cameron Journal podcast and walking us through these industries.
Great. Well, I appreciate you having me, and I hope people are able to learn a little bit more about the problem we're facing.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.